Number 1. Something stronger. This might seem like your typical runaway story. I know that in many of the stories I've read and heard, the parents are asses or something, and that causes the kid to run away from home. This was pretty much the same for me. I never really liked my family very much. My teenage years were pretty much a nightmare. But what happened to me when I left was a much worse nightmare. I was 16 years old. I got into a huge fight with my parents. Again, this wasn't unusual. But the fight got physical, and my father, who was a huge man, was beating the hell out of me. I had finally had enough of him, and when he knocked me over, I grabbed a lamp, hauled off, and hit him upside the head, knocking him silly. I then told him if he ever hit me again, I would kill him. I didn't want to give him the chance to hit me, though. I went into my room, put the things that mattered into my backpack, went out onto my motorcycle and left. On that very first drive, I drove really far away. I had some money from a part-time job I had for years, so I wasn't completely out of resources. But I also didn't feel like blowing my money on things that I didn't need. I had a very good friend named Jack, who lived in his parents' basement, and I went to see if I could spend the night there. Jack was agreeable. I mean, I had spent the night at his place plenty of times before, but he did have company. There was a girl there, and apparently she had sold Jack a lot of weed. So we had a really nice time. All three of us got very high, had a lot of snacks, and eventually fell asleep. The following day, we all three kept hanging out. We smoked more of the weed, and I got to talking more to the girl, Mandy. She was pretty cool, and she wasn't Jack's girlfriend. He also had no interest in her, and told me I could pursue her if I wanted. But we really just spent a lot of time talking and smoking more weed. Late into the following night, Mandy asked me if I would like to try something stronger. I told her hell yeah. She asked if I wanted to go to her place, and I was keen on the idea. Jack had brought her there, so I had to take her home on my motorcycle. She was really touchy-feely while riding behind me, and I seriously began to think I might be getting some. Mandy took me into the hills. We lived in a fairly rural area, but I really didn't go out into the country too often. I didn't like riding my motorcycle on the dirt roads. Also, at night, it was weird riding on those roads. They were small, with woods on each side of them, and it was creepy. I always felt like I was being watched, or like something could jump out of the woods at any time. Being in a car would have felt much better. Eventually, however, we came to her driveway. It was short, and just led to a really old but big house. We rode up and I parked the bike. I walked behind Mandy up to the house. There were no lights, so the house looked very foreboding. She opened the door and walked into the house. I was wondering when she was going to turn on the light. I stood in the doorway as she walked over to the front hallway. There was a small lamp on the table. She turned it on, and it emitted a very faint light. But it showed me something. The very big shadow of a man standing at the far end of the hallway. I couldn't make out features, but I could see that he was carrying a knife. Frightened, I stepped backward. I then heard a noise, and turned and looked behind me. I looked just in time to see another man, whose features I couldn't make out in the dark, coming up behind me. He grabbed me and held a knife up to my neck. Before I could do a single thing, the man sliced into me below my neck. The other guy from inside the house had advanced on me, and he stabbed me in the chest. And then he stabbed me 2 more times before the guy in the back knocked me to the ground. Mandy checked through my pockets, found my wallet and all of my money. The 3 jerks then left, got into a car, and left me for dead. What I was able to do next was nothing short of a miracle. I was covered in blood. I was in complete and utter agony, but I guess my survival instinct kicked in. I was able to force myself to get up and get on my motorcycle. It was hell to try and get it started, but it was worse to get it going. I rode out as best I could, down the driveway, down the dirt road, until I found the first house and driveway I came across. I drove up, crashing my bike in front of the house. An elderly man came out of the house with a shotgun, but when he saw me there, drenched in blood, he called for his wife to call an ambulance. And long story short, I survived, thanks to those 2 wonderful people. And the police caught Mandy, who was brought up on charges of assault and attempted murder. The 2 guys with her, though, had taken the money and beaten her down. They didn't stab her, though. She still had to go to the hospital, and that was where she was caught. She refused to identify them, and I couldn't, because I hadn't seen them well enough. Mandy, once she was stabilized, went to jail for a long time. I went to live with my aunt, whom I stayed with until I went to college. I still have some pretty nasty scars that girls always ask about when we get intimate. I don't know. I don't always like telling the story, because it sucks to relive the memory of the scariest thing to ever happen to me. Number 2. Me and my bear. I ran away from home once. I was really young, too. I was only 10 years old. You know, I was too young to really understand what running away was. What I do know is that I always had issues with my dad. I guess I was a mama's boy. But also, being a middle child, it seemed like he treated me bad. I wasn't the oldest, and I wasn't the baby. It was blatantly unfair and painful. In fact, my older brother would often do things and then blame them on me. My dad always took his side, for no other reason than he was the obvious favorite child. The day that this happened, I was in my bedroom. I was called down by my dad, who sounded very angry. And when I went down, he told me that $5 was missing from his wallet. He demanded the money back. I told him that I didn't take any money from him. He wouldn't believe me. Obviously, my older brother had taken the money, and then told my dad it was me. I insisted over and over that I didn't do anything. And my dad grabbed my arm, held me at arm's length, and hit me on the butt 10 times really hard. He then sent me to my room and told me I couldn't have dinner. I immediately went into my room and fell on my bed crying. I was hurting physically, but I was hurting more emotionally. I was tired of being treated this way. I decided then that I was going to run away. And keep in mind that I was still very young, and I really didn't understand the difficulty that this would entail. I simply got a small blanket, wrapped my teddy bear in it, and hung it from my baseball bat, so I looked like a classic hobo. I then climbed out of my window. I determined I would never see my family again. I walked through the backs of the houses, so my neighbors wouldn't see me. I got out of my neighborhood. It's weird how not a lot of people paid attention to me. I mean, I was a 10-year-old kid carrying a bear on a bat. But no one paid much attention. What ended up affecting me the most was that I didn't expect to come down from the anger. But I did. I had been out for about 2 or 3 hours, just walking, before I realized that I had no idea where I was. I decided I wanted to go back home and just deal with being treated like crap. At least I would have my room in which to do it. The problem was that I walked so far away that I got lost. I had no idea where I was or what way I had to go to get back, and I didn't know how I could ask anyone to help me. Eventually, the frustration got to me and I started crying. I didn't know what to do. It was then that I felt someone touch me on the shoulder. Looking around, I saw a large man standing behind me. I was scared at first, but he seemed kind. He asked me why I was crying. I knew that I was not supposed to talk to strangers, but I figured that if I talked to him, he might be able to help me get home. I explained my situation to him. He asked if I knew my home phone number and offered to call my parents for me. I was happy and grateful and followed him into his house. I hoped he would call my parents right away, but he didn't. He asked me if I needed something to eat or to take a nap. I told him I was tired, but I just wanted to go home. He insisted it would be better if I took a nap first. I kept begging him to call my parents, and I began crying. The man visibly got angry at me. He grabbed me roughly by the arm and told me I was going to take a nap. He pulled me roughly behind him. I tried to resist but was unable to. I kept crying and bawling, and he began taunting me, calling me a baby. He dragged me into a room, and I was terrified to see that it was like a nursery with a crib. This part is hard to tell, so bear with me. The man forcibly removed my clothing and put me in a diaper. He told me if I was going to act like a baby, he was going to treat me like one. I had a feeling he had planned this out beforehand when he saw me crying, but I was terrified, not sure what was going to happen. He obviously had a temper, and I really felt like I was in danger. While he was forcibly putting me into the crib, I immediately heard a knocking at the door. The man told me to be quiet and threatened my life if I didn't. He went and answered the door, and thank God it was the police. Apparently, a neighbor who knew the man had a criminal past saw him take me into the house. I heard the guy deny it at first, and then I heard a struggle. Next thing I knew, an officer came into the room. I was embarrassed, being in a crib and a diaper, but I was happy. The officer let me change my clothes before he took me to the police station. My parents came and were crying, wondering why I ran away. I was too happy to care to mention it. My parents brought me home and treated me a lot better for a while. The man who took me into the house was convicted on kidnapping charges. Apparently, he had served time for this before, so he got a long sentence. He is still in jail today. Number 3, California. My running away was not something that was spontaneous. I had it planned out. I wanted to run off to Hollywood and get a job as an actor. I acted in high school, and I was sure that I would be able to make it in Hollywood. I got a part-time job, saved up every paycheck, and made sure I had a nice wad of money before I headed out. I bought myself a Greyhound ticket to California, and I was pretty sure fortune was waiting for me. Well, first, riding a Greyhound bus is a horror in itself. Honestly, it took 4 days to get to California. I couldn't really sleep on the bus, and so by the time that I got to California, I was completely exhausted. Getting off the bus, I didn't feel as good as I hoped I would. I honestly just wanted to find somewhere to sleep. That was my first problem. I couldn't get a hotel room because I was only 17 years old. I tried several places, but was unable to get any of them to give me a room. I felt like I was going to die. It didn't make sense to me because I had the money. After looking for a room, I made an awful decision. I went and found a rather dry alley. I found a little nook and tried to sleep in it. I wasn't sure how long I fell asleep before I felt someone tugging on my arm. Looking up, there were 2 street punks standing over me. One was a girl and the other a guy. They looked pretty dirty as well, so I figured they must have been homeless. I was frightened at first, but they were telling me that if I needed a place to sleep, there was a house that a bunch of kids were squatting at. They'd be happy to help me out for some money. Well, I figured I was going to pay for a hotel room anyway, so I gave them a little bit of money. They happily led me to an old boarded-up house, and we broke into it. I wasn't sure what to think of the house. It was like something out of a horror movie. There were quite a bit of people in it. They were all gathered into groups, though. Many of them looked at me, but didn't seem to pay me any mind. The 2 punks I was with had a room that had a couple mattresses lying on the floor. And they told me they kept this room, and I could go ahead and sleep on one of the mattresses. I was so happy I was finally going to get some sleep that I didn't care that it was on an old mattress in a squatting home. They gave me something to drink too, which was awesome, and I drank it down fast. I immediately plopped down on one of the mattresses and fell asleep. I woke up a little later, and no one was in the room with me. I felt awful and was having trouble breathing. The world was sort of unreal around me, but I know that I felt sick and was having breathing issues. Although I was weak feeling, I still managed to get up and stumble around. I fished around for my wallet and couldn't find it. I didn't worry about it. I did my best to make it out of the house, even though it was a really hard task. There were others in the house still, but they were either asleep or passed out. I managed to not only get out of the house, but I stumbled down the street. I can't tell you how hard all this was because I had breathing issues. I stumbled into a diner and tried to tell the host to call me an ambulance because of my breathing issues, but then I passed out, and I woke up in a hospital. The punks that had picked me up had stolen my wallet, which stupidly had all of my money in it as cash. They had taken my belongings from my bag, and for some reason they had drugged my drink, and that they likely thought would cause an overdose. And it did, but luckily I did not die from it. The hospital didn't have my ID, and therefore did not call my parents. Once I was stabilized, I was released from the hospital, and immediately I found a homeless shelter. I was determined that despite the difficulty of my experience, I would rebuild my life. The shelter had a room full of cots, and it was nice to get some sleep. However, on the very first night sleeping there, something woke me up. I opened my eyes to see the male punk that had taken me to the house and drugged me. He was standing over me with a freaking knife. "I thought you were dead, you little fucker," he whispered to me. I immediately began screaming, thinking the guy was gonna try and kill me. The screaming woke up several people in the room with me, and they saw what was going on. The punk tried to run out of the room, but he was caught by a worker. He was arrested for aggravated assault for holding the knife over me. Unfortunately, there was no evidence he drugged me, so he didn't get charged with that. Even though he was gone, please don't think that I went back home or anything. That seems to be the way of many stories like this. I remained in California, living in the shelter. I eventually got a job, not as an actor, though, and got an apartment. I kept upgrading, and now I work a decent 9-to-5 job, and I have a nice apartment in West Hollywood. But I will never forget the awful experience I had when I ran away from home. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope you enjoyed these stories. I included a non-teenage story because I thought it was definitely one of the more frightening stories that I have read about running away. If you want to read print versions of these stories, check them out at the Killer Orange Cat subreddit. Links to that and the merchandise store are in the description. In the meantime, if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below, or using the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Feel free to leave me a comment to let me know what you think of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can always follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter using the links in the description. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address provided in the description. My main requirement is that the story is original, meaning it has not yet been read on any other YouTube channel. And please, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.